Welcome to today's webinar titled Delphi or Not Delphi, Selecting the Appropriate Expert Elicitation Approach, sponsored by ISPOR corporate partner Open Health. Before we begin the webinar, I do have a few quick housekeeping reminders to go over. All attendees have joined in listen-only mode. The Zoom chat feature is disabled for this webinar. Please submit any questions to the speakers using the Q&A feature. Our speakers are looking forward to answering your questions after their presentations. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for on-demand viewing via email to all registered attendees and on the ISPOR webinar series webpage in approximately 2 business days. This webinar is also using Zoom polling, and we encourage your participation. When the Zoom poll is launched, a window will automatically open on your screen with the question. If the window does not open, or if you close the poll window by mistake, click on the polling icon within your Zoom toolbar to reopen. Select your answer from the choices or type your response back if a text box appears, and click Submit to lock in your answer. It is now my pleasure to invite today's moderator to begin the webinar.
Hi everyone, thank you very much for joining us today. My name's Nick Denham. I'm a senior real world evidence consultant at Open Health. I'm joined by my colleague Adeli, who's a research consultant within the patient-centered outcomes team at Open Health. Emanuele, a JCE coordinator from UCB, and last but not least, Valentina, who's the executive director at the European Patients Forum. We'll be presenting to you today on sort of Delphi or not to Delphi. As has been said, if you have any questions throughout, please do message them into the chat and we'll be able to answer where we can. So to go into the first slide, so my section, I'm going to talk about some different structured expert elicitation methods and why we would undertake a structured expert elicitation study. So on the first slide, please, why would you undertake one? So when data is limited, how can we produce transparent, reproducible, and defensible estimates for decision making? We require multiple opinions, not just a single viewpoint. A formal systematic process, not informal discussions that you're having between different colleagues or partners, a formal system. We need to elicit uncertainty from experts. And finally, we need to combine these opinions in a controlled way by avoiding conflict and watered down compromises, as quite often occurs. On the next slide, so how would we create a reliable structured expert elicitation? We need to define the problem clearly. You would come up with an example such as, why are patients taken off of drug X because of Y? That's our problem that we're going to discuss. We need to identify what quantities we want to elicit. Is that probabilities, percentages, days, if it's to come about why we'd need to take patients off? We want to understand that first. We need to pick experts with relevant knowledge and a diversity of perspectives. We don't want 20 experts all from the same hospital in London. We want a difference across geographies, experiences, therapeutics areas where possible. Make that a nice wide team to get the best range of opinions and elicitations that you can. We also want to balance the method with the timelines and costs. Some methods may take days, some may take months, and of course, costing as well. When we're contracting with different experts, where possible, things may take quite a bit of time. So you really need to put that into perspective beforehand. You also need to avoid complex designs and methodologies. We're working with some of the best experts in the world in their field. They have valuable time. We do not want to be wasting time trying new technologies, new webinar formats. Keep it simple. Questionnaires, meetings that everyone knows and experiences, so you get the best value out of the time you have with these experts. And finally, you need to select the right protocol. So I'm going to go through a couple of examples of different protocols. The first one on the next slide being SHELF, the Sheffield Elicitation Framework. You may have heard of these before, which is brilliant, but if not, what SHELF is it's a facilitated group process where experts discuss and agree on single consensus probability distributions. It focuses on a qualitative measure while emphasizing transparency and shared understanding. It's really to be used in economic models and HTAs where you need to use defensible distributions. Rather than saying we assumed this value, we're trying to say this distribution reflects structured expert consensus under a validated protocol. How it works is experts provide individual judgment on uncertainty. Then a facilitated structure is in place used to reconcile views, ultimately producing a single consensus probability distribution. There's a couple of theoretical examples there. But on the next slide, I'll walk you through a real-life published example, which is really interesting and great to see how it works. So in this case, they're informing long-term survival extrapolations using alternate parameter distributions. What you can see on the left-hand side is real-world data. These are the long-term survival applications over 2 years under these people, under the trial conditions. What you can see at 3, 5, and 10 years is when 6 experts were asked to come together, look at the real data, and discuss their opinions. And in the publication, you can see as well, expert 1 said this, expert 2 said this. We don't name the experts, but you can discuss what they said individually. Finally, they all came together to decide on a consensus on what these models may look like based on their opinion. And you can see with the pink arrows pointing to the brown data points there. On the next slide, you'll be able to see what models were undertaken on just the real-world data. The consensus, the brown data points, that's just there for visualization. So you can see what the models look like without their data, without the expert data input. And on the next slide, we can see what we look like where the data has been input. You can see how the models change, how that the expert opinion has been brought into the models to bring the change in outputs. On the next slide, I'm going to discuss the nominal group technique. What this is a structured group method where experts independently generate and rank ideas, provide structured, unbiased way to identify and prioritize key drivers, assumptions, or outcomes when empirical evidence is limited, rather than saying we pick these drivers based on informal discussion. What we're trying to say is these priorities were systematically generated and ranked by experts using structured and biased processes. Effectively, what we're doing is we're bringing experts to individually generate ideas, share them together in a group space, and then from their discussions and their new learnings and what they've had from those discussions, rank them to produce a prioritized list of outcomes. Again, putting some theoretical examples there. On the next slide, we can see a real-life example. This is also a virtual example. So many of these formats require in-person meetings, but you can adjust them accordingly to do it virtually, especially post-COVID. I'm going back to when I referenced experts' time is valuable. You'll be able to get experts for an hour or 2 hours remotely compared to trying to fly in 8 experts from around the world for a couple of days to have a single meeting. So in this case, the experts were trying to rank and prioritize clinical indicators for applications in primary care research. Firstly, on the left-hand side, they were giving a survey to rank, I think it was about 20 characteristics. What do they think was the primary characteristics that we should be focusing on at prioritizing characteristics? They then had a meeting to discuss and rank these between them, discuss openly. Everyone gets to have their input and discuss. Following that, they had a second survey. This was asking them not to rank, but to score out of 100. And what you can see is how, following their discussions, their prioritizations changed, such as for heart failure. Originally, they thought it would be the 5th most prioritized aspect, and it's moved up to the 3rd, and this can continue throughout. It's a really good example of how it can be done virtually and used in practice as well. Finally, I'm going to discuss sort of 2 other sort of techniques. So there is on the next slide. Thank you. Yep, that's the one. The Cook's classical model. This is a really interesting model that, using calibration questions, it ranks experts' judgments. It really ask you to look into this yourself. It's a really good one, but it takes quite a while to explain and understand. Very exciting in use cases as well. What experts do is they independently provide probabilistic estimates, which, using their statistical evaluation on their calibration, it's combined through performance-based weighting to produce an aggregated distribution. Finally, there's the IDEA protocol, the investigate, discuss, estimate, and aggregate, which is a combination between the Cook's method and the modified Delphi. The modified Delphi we'll discuss together in a moment. On my final slide is just a table discussing the different different aspects of each of the protocols that we've discussed. So you can see how some are more mathematical based, asking for written input, behavioral based for their discussions, and the different strengths and limitations of each. For example, you can see in the shelf protocol, a limitation is that if you do not have a skilled facilitator, there's a very high chance that individual members and experts could overpower the discussion, rather than letting some of the quieter experts involved as well. So what you really need to do is focus on why you want to undertake certain protocols, the resources you have available to you, what outcomes you're looking for. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Adele. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nick. And hello, everyone. I'm Adele, and I will be discussing in more detail the Delphi technique. So first of all, what is a Delphi? So a Delphi is defined as a method of eliciting and refining group judgments. If we look at the core purpose of Delphi, it's to generate consensus statements from a group of experts on complex issues that are characterized by uncertainty. And why is it relevant in healthcare research? Delphis can provide reputable and actionable evidence to inform payers and provider decision making when traditional clinical trials or literature are insufficient. But if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, what actually a Delphi looks like. In this slide, you can see generally the overview of a standard Delphi. So we start with our evidence gap and our research question. And this is followed by a stage of collection and revision of existing evidence. This is normally done by literature review, but there are also some qualitative steps that can be done, like focus groups or one-to-one interviews. And this is all to collect evidence to actually inform the development of a consensus survey. Once the consensus survey is developed, it's given to our experts, and this would be our Delphi panelists. And just to give you an idea, a Delphi panel can be composed from maybe 9 panelists, but depending also on the diversity required in the group, they can be much, much larger. And panelists are asked to complete the survey, and then the responses are actually grouped and summarized in one group response. Then panelists are asked to complete the survey another time. But this time, when they will complete the survey, they'll be able to see for each item of the survey how their answer actually compares to the group response in the previous round. And so it starts this kind of iterative process where expert can actually every time refine their judgments also based on what they saw other participants actually answered in previous rounds. And this can go on for a predetermined number of rounds. It can be 2, 3, 4, or it can be up until certain level of consensus has been achieved, or yes, or when we observe a stability of response. And after that, the researchers can actually analyze and synthesize the areas where consensus is achieved, or areas where no consensus has been achieved. And they can also review the feedback, the qualitative feedback that experts will be asked also to provide while responding to the survey, to better contextualize also the consensus that has been achieved, and also better understand why certain areas remained without agreement. And if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, if we look at some key methodological characteristics of Delphi panels, so when we talk about a consensus survey, it's a survey that consists of statements that are derived indeed from this literature synthesis step and qualitative data collection step that I was mentioning before. And panelists are asked to express their level of agreement with the statements using standardized Likert scales. And normally these go from strongly disagree to strongly agree. A very important characteristic of Delphi that it's not always the case in many other similar study design, is the anonymity of participants. So participants remain anonymous to one another throughout the entire survey process, and this prevents dominant personalities or authority figures to actually skew the results and avoid groupthink. Then the other two important characteristics are the iteration and the control feedback that I was mentioning before when we were looking at the study flow. So the expert actually respond to the survey on multiple rounds. They can refine their judgments every time, and they can refine them because they will be able to see the anonymized summary of results that they will be provided. That basically summarizes the results of the previous rounds. And this kind of encourage them to converge into one response and provide the correct answer. But when we say correct, we don't mean that every answer in the end has to converge to a consensus, but we just mean that every time, just by looking at what their colleague have responded, they're just sure that they are provided the answer that is correct for themselves. And then finally, just to show you that the Delphi panels have reached qualitative input that then are grouped into statistical group responses, and results are presented as statistical aggregate. It can be median, mean scores. It can be also percentages of agreement and of disagreement, and this provide a sense of objectivity also of the results. And if we go to the next slide. Yes, just briefly, some of the main strengths of this design. As Nick was mentioning also before, Delphi are very helpful for closing evidence gaps in the literature areas where literature is conflicting. They're relatively cost and time effective projects, so nowadays they're normally done online. So they are significantly faster and more cost effective than having, for instance, to organize a series of in-person meetings. And for the same reason, they also allowed for wide geographic flexibilities. And then, regarding the informed judgments, they're excellent because they help translating nuances of clinical decision making into actual data that can support then strategic planning. And next slide, please. Yes, thanks. So if we look at some different approaches to conducting a Delphi panel, the traditional approach, it's normally used for very early stage research question areas where there is very limited prior evidence, so exploratory areas. The consensus statement survey is actually developed together with the panelists. So the first round is normally questionnaire with open-ended question, and the results are actually used to develop the statements themselves. And this is one of the main difference of traditional Delphi with the modified Delphis, because modified Delphis have actually a steering committee that supports the development of the consensus survey, and the steering committee is a group, a very limited group of experts that actually supports the development of the survey. So by the time that the survey gets to the panelist, it has already gone through kind of step of revision from the steering committee. And this makes them a little bit more efficient, a little bit more structured, and reduces slightly the participants' burden. However, these modified Delphis do have to be done in areas where some prior literature and evidence is available. Then finally, we have the real-time Delphi. Real-time Delphi, the rationale behind them, it's very similar to the one of the modified Delphis. The only difference, it's really the consensus process. So these ones are also called roundless Delphi because they don't really have a structured rounds like the ones that I was explaining before, but rather the survey goes online, and participants can actually see as they respond to the survey, they can see automatically the group response. The only limit of this option is that sometimes, for instance, for participants that participate they complete the survey very early on, they might not be able to compare it with the answer of many other participants because they have not yet completed. So the researchers have actually a bit less control to how many times the panelists actually go into the survey and complete it. But they are very useful for very time-sensitive projects. And then if we go to the next slide, please. Yes, so to just go back to the first question of the webinar, Delphi or not Delphi, I just wanted to highlight a few applications of Delphi. The first one would be clinical standardization and clinical pathway optimization. So Delphi can be very useful in all those areas, for instance, where we want to look at optimal sequence or duration of certain therapy. They're also good to position a product into the clinical pathway. The evidence can be used also to inform the development of guidelines. We can look, for instance, at consensus on dosing. Another interesting application is to inform economic models in those areas where real-world data is actually missing. Delphi panel and the experience of experts can actually help to estimate, for instance, the frequency and the type of medical services that are required by a certain patient population, or what could be the expected uptake of a therapy. And then the data standardization and evaluation framework. Delphis can be helpful because they can support indeed with developing diagnosis criteria, definition. They can also support the development of key indicators of metrics or metrics that can be used to evaluate the technologies. And actually, this will be the focus of the next presentation. Here, I just wanted to highlight a couple of examples. In case you're interested, we can provide the links. It's just to show you how Delphis can be used in this for these mentioned applications. Then if we go into the next slide. Yes, in this last slide, I just wanted to bring up a few methodological guidelines, some literature that are available to guide the conducting and also reporting of Delphi panels. These are all relatively recent work that also highlight how Delphi are there is a growing interest in this methodology, and indeed also in standardizing and increasing the quality of this methodology. So we have the RAN methodological guidelines, Accord, and Delphi started actually report on the guidelines for reporting Delphi panels. And I've just highlighted a few criteria on the right that can be kept in mind when should be kept in mind when conducting a Delphi, but also when actually reviewing or reading an article reporting on a Delphi. To keep in mind for this quality kind of parameters. So some criteria that have to be set a priori, the definition of experts, how were they defined, the consensus threshold, and what was the evidence base for the consensus statements. And this was my last slide, so I will hand over to Emanuele, but before that, there should be a poll. Yes, we have a little question for you, so just to warm you up for the next session, and I hand over to you, Emanuele.
All
Perfect.
right,
yeah.
The poll should be launched. Do you guys see it live on your screen?
Yes, I can see it at least.
Perfect.
And I'm going to answer. Oh, no, I cannot vote. Well,
yeah,
yes. So
you might not be able to vote as a panelist.
No, indeed. I think we wanted to get an idea of the familiarity you have with these methods, specifically in the context of HTA, before we deep dive a bit into a case study that we did with a European Patient Forum and AMDA. I will talk about it a little bit more in details, especially in relation to JCA, and great timing because it came out last week. So we're going to deep dive at the end also on some of the learnings and how maybe this could have, in our opinion, facilitated the process, but that will be up to Valentina to talk about it. So yeah, should we wait maybe a few more seconds? Okay, we can see the results. Great. So over 50% of you are not familiar with this methodology in the context of HTA. In previous research, it has been used for several aspects, and there is a growing trend to use it. And we hope that in the following case study that we will discuss, we, are able to let you think together of whether some of these methods can be used further, especially on the challenges that JCA and more broadly the HTA landscape, policy landscape poses in front of us. Cool. So without further ado, please, if you can, yes, go to the next slide. We'll present with, I will present the work that we did with Valentina from European Patient Forum. I'm currently a JCI coordinator at UCB, but this exercise was conducted while I was at Open Health with Adele and the support of Valentina, and most importantly, EAMDA that you see at the bottom there. So what did we want to do? We had the idea to, address some of the picoscoping concerns, and especially with the focus on patients, right? Patient engagement, as the European HTA regulations offers a unique opportunity for patient engagement and stakeholder engagement more broadly, so also clinician, in the picoscoping process and the JCA process, as you're all very well aware. So we said, you know what, why don't we try with patients what it means to consolidate, not only explaining and negotiating in maybe an informal way, but maybe using a methodology that allows to drive consensus. And that was exactly what we tried to do. Building on what Adele presented, we used the modified Delphi to generate indeed consensus over several PICO items. And the first thing we did was actually testing and engaging with several patient associations across key disease area, of course, related to some of the key ongoing JCA activities. And we landed on CAR-T, given the uniqueness of the therapeutic landscape and the challenges that it poses for picoscoping, but most importantly, we thought it would have been the highest added value in terms of patient inputs, right? So we had the pleasure and extreme value that we had to collaborate with the EAMDA, the European Alliance of Neuromuscular Disorder, that was key to select and identify the patients. And we ended up with 12 panelists, including both patients and caregivers included. So if you go to the next slide, please. Right. Objectives, methodology, and there is one more, expected results. So let me guide you through a bit of our thinking. Objective, very simple. We wanted to obtain consensus, patient expert consensus on the PICO elements and see how this will, minimize heterogeneity across Europe. There were 3 underlying objectives behind this main objective, and these are more policy / context objective. First and foremost, increase the scientific validity of consensus of PICO consolidation and patient input, and increase transparency. So better understanding how stakeholder inputs and the consolidation process was shaped across the different stages, and therefore being able to actually, to a certain extent, replicate, but understand where the driver of consensus or dissent are. Of course, these, in our opinion, would have also allowed for a structured and consistent patient engagement from the very beginning. And we will see later a bit in explaining this exercise and explaining the UHTA regulation to patients. We were thinking of ensuring consistent engagement across the different rounds and also in the UHTA process. Finally, of course, this exercise repeated over and over would allow patient associations, PAGs, and researchers to promote this cross-border collaboration and be able in the future to replicate this process, to synthesize European needs, European healthcare system differences, to finally get to a more simplified European voice, acknowledging all the differences. Therefore, what we followed was a modified Delphi panel. We wanted a minimum of 12 panelists, and I'm happy to say that there was not a problem at all. The engagement was very high. We filled in the positions very quickly. And after that, we developed the survey together with the steering committee that was composed of a clinician, 2 clinicians from 2 different countries with slightly different profiles, a policy expert and a patient expert. The steering committee members were not part of the panelists, but they drove a lot of the survey and the selection criteria, which we show in a bit to select the relevant panelist. Then we had 3 rounds. First round with interviews, 101 with each panelist, where we actually discussed with them what this exercise was about, often going into a detail of what is a PICO, what it means to do PICO scoping in the UHTA context. So it was extremely valuable to share those insights and, most importantly, guide the panelists through the different questions and record the meeting so that then we could transcribe the qualitative inputs to better shape the statements down the line. And I will discuss it briefly later. What we did then, we are aggregating consensus for each of the rounds, as Adele has explained, both in qualitative and quantitative terms, share it back to the panelists, particularly for those items where we didn't reach consensus, and where there were open, new items coming up from the qualitative analysis. And we did that across 3 rounds. So at the end of it, we were able to report, the statements that reach consensus, how they reach consensus, and most importantly, what we're doing also today, we're disseminating the findings. More broadly, the expected results. First of all, we wanted to test the appropriateness of this method. We wanted to disseminate the results for us to brainstorm and think about it, think if this is a way forward, and finally advocate for the integration of consensus methodology to address a lot of the transparency issue, of the single voice issue representing an entire continent, and allow for structured patient and clinician involvement in HTA process. So ultimately, the main outcome was for patients. First and foremost, as I was saying, have UHTA visibility, understanding better this process, especially for an asset that was coming for them. Being able to generate group inputs, addressing differences across Europe, and finally, engage more actively in the HTA process. Can you go to the next slide, please? So this is what it looked like. The criteria that we chose were, each panelist needed to be an active member of an SMA patient community and have experience with patient representativeness. And indeed, later in these numbers, I will discuss what that meant. But you can see we have 12 panelists representing a broad geographic coverage of Europe, and all of them were included across all 3 rounds, so we had no dropout. 100% of the panelists felt somewhat to very comfortable representing the voice of SMA patients. So they felt that they had the representativeness of the patients and caregivers in their country. And I want to specify this difference because it's a key item that drove the results, which we were not expecting at first. So we had a broad range of profiles, including patients, actual patients, and caregivers, and patient experts, right? And we, at the end of it, we understood that more research was needed to untangle some of the differences, but these, consensus brought out the differences in perspective that the different patient profiles have. 100% of panelists were actively involved in PAGS activity, and the vast majority of them, 89% of the panelists, were in constant contact in their country with above 50 patients or caregivers, so between 50 and 200. So we're talking about representatives of active groups. Only 11% were between 5 and 10. None of the patients, of the panelists included, say that they didn't feel representing the voice of their patient community. Can you go to the next slide? Yes. And here we go with the results. So here it's a lot of colors and a lot of numbers. But I don't want to go into too much into the detail also because we don't have the time. And indeed, we have published already the manuscript with the results where we go much more into the detail of this. We have 2 manuscripts, actually. The first one is in the reasoning, and it's an opinion paper. And the second one is the one with the actual results where you have much more details. But what I want to get you to get from this slide is really the build-up of consensus. And I would like you to focus on the green boxes and how they differ between the different PICOS items. Of course, for example, you see that for population, it was quite challenging in the first rounds to get consensus given the nature of the disease, and we will see a bit later also the characteristics of the product. Was also something indeed that drove the divergence in the intervention characteristics, and similar to comparators. So population and comparator were the one, as expected, that from the very beginning we had more difficulties in reaching consensus because of the language, because of the text, because of the information and the perspective that are quite different. It was different for outcomes and study designs, where we were closer to consensus already in first rounds. But most importantly, I would say the final results, as you can see in the right column of the slide, we were able to reach the vast majority of consensus on the items we actually asked across all the PIGO criteria and PIGO items. And I think this speaks to itself to the level of not only negotiation, but understanding that went across the 3 different rounds. Finally, what I want to say is there is not one solution fits all in terms of when you will get consensus for the different items. For some items like population intervention, we got it later, and we had to understand better the details, shape the text of the statements accordingly. For some others, we got it earlier. So it's essential to go through the 3 different rounds to be able to properly bring everybody on board on where we can find consensus, and ultimately also knowledge that somewhere you cannot. So we left it there. If you can go to the next slide, please. Yes, here we go. So what was the consensus we reached? And I don't want to go too much into the detail of this slide again for the same reason as I mentioned earlier. We don't have a lot of time, but here we highlighted key consensus items that were reached. So first and foremost, for the population patients, after quite some adjustments, were able to agree on broader inclusion criteria than just the trial characteristics, and the understanding of, such as, for example, pre-symptomatic patients. The age restriction was seen as a challenge. The trial criteria only indeed are a key starting point, but are not the end point. We also, the patients and caregivers also stressed the need to move towards a shared decision making. So we were also asking who should decide who gets these drugs, and indeed the consideration of patient and caregiver personal preferences were a key driver of consensus. So it's a shared decision between physicians, of course, and patient caregivers. And this is a recurring theme. We will see patient preferences to come up often, and here is one of the first ones. Of course, there are also items we didn't get consensus on. These are, for example, motor and respiratory function, but indeed the exclusivity of the trial of inclusion criteria for the identification of the target population. So we couldn't, which goes in the consensus we reached earlier. However, the starting point of trial criteria was one of the key items that we needed to negotiate across the different rounds, right, to find consensus on. For intervention, there were a lot of items there. We have 18 items. That's where a lot of inputs were provided from the patients, of course. And these, we felt it was worth expanding on it because of the healthcare system characteristics and differences. So a lot of the items here focused on how the healthcare system would uptake and deliver this drug, and indeed the need for specialized care, the comprehensive planning, which was there in some countries but not in every country, the caregiver support, as well as management of corticosteroid burden. So we went also into some clinical details, as well as equitable access and patient-centered treatment. So we had quite a lot of items where patients felt, okay, we need these things to be taken into consideration. This sent persistence on the preference for CAR-T, and this also has to do with the nature of the product over other therapeutic modalities, but as well as the administration method, the role of indirect costs. And here you see one of the first differences between caregiver and patients, where patients were really driving the focus on also indirect costs, whereas caregiver were mostly saying, we don't care about it, and therefore we will not able to reach consensus on those items, but it's part of the result, as well as emphasis on individualized decision-making. Again, going back to the difference between caregiver and patients. If you can go to the next slide, and I'll try to speed up. I just gave you an example, right? No active in comparators. again, we agree, there was agreement and consensus on the non-active treatment and the focus on best supportive care, integrating patient and caregiver input in selecting the comparator, again, going back to the patient preference, and sharing of information. So there was a strong need to say we need simplified information to be able to understand and choose ourselves what is best for us, given the patient characteristics. For outcomes, prioritizing clinical outcomes, this is an item that was very early on already we reached consensus on, also because we did a ranking exercise that we will see in the next slide, where we asked patients and caregivers to rank their preferred outcomes. And this was quickly led us to actually get statements saying, okay, for patients and caregivers, we really want to focus on clinical outcomes, quality of life, and caregiver preferences, patient and caregiver preferences. But most importantly, what came up from the first round, which we did not expect, was a strong consensus on the more sensitive measurement tools needed. And if this exercise would have done much earlier on, such as early bigoscoping, when the company is maybe running the trial, this would have led maybe to some additional instruments or perfecting the instrument, right? Which patients were strongly felt it was needed, such as also doctors. And the trial access across Europe. What we didn't manage to get consensus was, of course, prioritizing maybe survival and motor skills over caregiver quality. And again, here you see the difference between patient and caregiver. Study design, there was broad consensus on study design overall. The need for a more comprehensive package, not only the RCT, goes back to the RCT inclusion criteria, but a focus on RWE to actually grasp healthcare system differences, PROs for patient preferences, and single-arm trials, which were seen as, of course, in this case, a needed, acceptable study design, and broader EU participation. We couldn't find consensus on trial location. Again, this was one of the items that maybe needed further explanation, as well as the willingness to trade off innovation and for stronger evidence. And indeed, if you maybe move to the next slide. Yes, if you move to the next slide, you see the ranking exercises that we did in the first round. So on the left side, we asked patients to rank the outcomes. And what you see is from left to right, the number of first choice versus fifth choice for each of these outcomes. So you see a strong focus on overall survival, of course, across all patients. That led to easy consensus development afterwards. But most interesting, on the right side of the slide, what you can see is a trade-off or ranking of uncertainty. We ask patients to rank how willing are they to trade off uncertainty for speed of access. And this led to very interesting discussions that then fed our qualitative analysis to be able to develop further statements down the line. And generally, patients in this case, because of the availability of other treatments, felt that they were, somewhat moderately, they wanted moderately accessible information, accessible innovation, but with moderate certainty. So across the 4 items, basically from high uncertainty to low uncertainty, they chose the third one overall. But there is some variety, as you can see. And yeah, with that, if you move to the next slide, I will quickly speak about the role of qualitative comments. Here, I will not go into the detail, but for you, if you want to get a feeling of how much the qualitative comments were useful to drive the consensus, I leave it up to here. We are happy to share the slides again later if needed. But yeah, this is to summarize the relevance of qualitative comments and qualitative analysis, especially in first round, to be able to drive consensus down the line. And I think this is my last slide, right? If you go to the next slide. Yes, we want your input again. And with that, after this question, I will leave the floor to Valentina that will guide us a bit through the policy learning. Yeah, I'll just read the question. Maybe, where do you see the highest added value of these methods for HTA and engagement in access? And yeah, you can choose multiple options. And thank you very much.
Thank you, Emanuele. So yeah, we'll give you some time to react, and then we continue with the final part of this presentation.
I still see answers coming in pretty consistently. Let's give it about 10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to close the poll and share the results.
Thank you. So the winner is addressing evidence gaps where data are limited, especially for rare diseases, followed by increasing validity and transparency of stakeholder alignment and engagement, meaning clinicians and patients. And then the third ranked is supporting early stage assessments and evidence generation strategies. Yes, I think this all somehow also aligns with the reasons why we wanted to conduct this study. Maybe we can move on with the next slide. And maybe just to explain, this study was conducted by EPF through European funding from the European Commission with in-kind support from Open Health, who have conducted also all the scientific study behind these results. Next slide, please. And I will share here the key outcomes and somehow the considerations drawing from this study. From a policy point of view, the starting point for us was really how we can reduce the fragmentation of the PCOS, because there was a high risk of having many different inputs from the patient side. And for me personally, as someone promoting patient involvement in HTA for many years, I wanted to avoid the risk of having very diverse inputs from patients coming from the same disease areas, because this somehow would jeopardize the outcomes and maybe also invalidate the input coming from patients. But actually, the outcomes we have received and as seen in this study are that the Delphi study allows for structured consensus building because it enables convergence on core outcomes, treatment preferences, study design, priorities through an iterative unbiased reflection and discussions. It also allowed for cross-European representation. As you know, right now under the HTA regulation, there is an opportunity for patients and caregivers to participate, but one or maximum two usually will be invited to contribute to a JCA or even a joint scientific consultation. And that's quite limiting because it doesn't allow to have the broader perspective of the patient communities. While through these studies, we were able to bring on board profiles coming from different geographies, different profiles, age ranges were taken into account, gender. So we were able to ensure a broader relevance and inclusivity through the qualitative and qualitative inputs. Last but not least, also, as I said, I mean, diverse profiles were taken into account. This also allowed to gain some nuances or how the perspectives from the patient side and the caregiver sides can differ, and what is behind those differences, actually. And also it allowed to have more clarity on divergences and also identifying clearly the areas of disagreements. We were not trying at all costs to identify consensus, but understand where maybe some disagreements could not be addressed. And last but not least, also gain some guidance for future research. We also came to the conclusions that this type of studies can be conducted for a JCA, earlier than a JCA, but also in the context of joint scientific consultations eventually, because there is a lot of content that can be also considered by health technology developers in the early stages of research and medicine development. Next one. I mean, this is just to iterate the key messages that I was mentioning earlier. In stronger and more meaningful patient engagement was not a primary objective at the very beginning of when the study was conceived. I must be honest. My only concern at that moment was just the fragmentation of PCOS. But as we moved on with this exercise, I realized how it can be much more impactful than a traditional way of involving patients. Also, the involvement of patient advocacy groups made a difference in the identification of relevant profiles and ensuring also a constant participation of all participants to the study. We had no withdrawal at all from this group, which was very interesting because also it took us a couple 2-3 months at least to complete the study, and all stayed involved till the very end. And all in all, also contributed to the development of the UHTA infrastructure. Now this study is also being considered for future uptake by assessors and co-assessors. Of course, there are some dilemmas there because we don't know yet whether to do and conduct this study for product or indications. There are uncertainties about the funding scheme because it's unclear who can take on board this responsibility. We are aware that the exercise is time consuming and demanding from this point of view, but we also want to stress the fact that it brings more appropriate representations of profiles. What we think should be included in future consensus building exercises similar to this one, healthcare professionals should stay involved, not only as member of the steering committees, but also joining the Delphi studies themselves. Next one. And here we come to some considerations because you know that the first JCA report was released last week. And of course, we wanted not to miss the opportunity to also bring this to this conversation. What we know so far about the report, about the first JCA, is that one caregiver was invited to contribute and provide patient input. The caregiver could contribute in 2 stages, in the scoping stage, in the PICO design phase, and in the draft review. This profile was invited to provide input on all the 8 PICOs from a family perspective, and they did so. And we also noticed that some other elements, like the fact that according to the caregiver, it should be given more importance to growth, development, long-term safety outcomes. They also felt that there were some evidence gaps in the study report related to health-related quality of life. So that there are several elements, and also looking more and more at the long-term outcomes potentially. So main findings include the fact that there should be a shift focused to quality of survival, including vision, cognition, and growth. As we said, the evidence practice gap due to missing real-world comparators, also access inequalities across EU, and last but not least, the limited transparency on how stakeholder input influenced conclusions. And that's maybe something that as a patient organizations, we keep stressing that should be addressed because we want to see how the patient input can also not just influence, but can inform the reporting. Next one. And this is my final slide. So our considerations here are that if we apply the Delphi panel in this JCA, probably some of the disagreements around the PICOs could have been addressed earlier. And we would have been able to build some consensus on handling individualized comparators. We would have had for sure stronger stakeholder engagement in the evidence generation phase, also bringing some real world evidence. Also, we would have been able to bring independent expert consensus to confirm alignment on the comparator data with the real world practice. So if we brought both clinicians and patients more broadly here, we would have had more robust data. And last but not least, also we would have improved the transparency of this and traceability through an iterative process, also bringing to clearer final conclusions. And this was my last slide. Here we have our final poll. We are asking you, where do you believe this methodology has a potential for joint clinical assessment? And what should happen next? So you can provide a short answer or one or two lines.
I'll leave this
Okay.
one open for about a minute just because it requires a typed response, and then we'll close it out and share the results. All right, everyone,
Yes.
10 more seconds. All right, I'm going to end it, share the results. Can we see the answers or no?
Not yet.
Okay, let's see here. All right, I can see them on my screen, so I'll just read through a few of them. Let's see. We have Pico building, valuable for all JCAs, worth the investment. Patients providing, lived experience for Pico definition, particularly for member states, would be good to have earlier assessment of where consensus can be found. Yes, to estimate parameters of uncertainty. Potential lies in resolving uncertainty and clinical evidence gaps for JCA. Next, stakeholders must co-create a validated protocol to integrate this method formally into the relative effectiveness assessment process. And then we have a few more that I will pull and provide to the speakers afterwards, but I feel like that was a good start.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you very much, everyone. Really appreciate all the questions coming in. We will try and answer some where we can. If not, if we can't answer on the call, we will get back to you too afterwards. There's sort of two main themes though coming through the question, and I think I'll ask the group the first one of why are we aiming for consensus, and what do we do when there is no consensus? Either everyone agrees to disagree, or answers are all over, we can't get any answers. And if that is the case, when do we stop with rounds? Why do we not go into round 10, 11, 12?
Maybe I can take this. It's a great point because it's true that we talk often about trying to get consensus and try to develop this consensus. But it's true that it's not always the case because sometimes identifying areas of non-consensus is equally important. So it really depends, like the topic that we are researching, and for how to manage, like when we are not seeing the consensus that maybe we were expecting. So as we were saying before, like sometimes the rounds for practical reasons are predetermined. We cannot like keep the panelists for in numerous rounds of surveys, so most of the time are like limited to two or three rounds. But another very important aspect to look at is the stability of responses. So instead of looking at whether we reach a certain amount of consensus, we look at the point where panelist answer actually doesn't change over the rounds. So we see the stability of their responses, and then we understand that all panelists have just provided their final answers.
Yeah, and
Right.
I would like to add that dissent in itself is a great result, especially for understanding the need of additional evidence and divergence between different profiles, such as the caregiver and patient, which we were not expecting at first to have such divergent views. But this is also part of the information of why we're doing this exercise. If you think that the opposite would be just to engage one single expert that should speak for the whole community, I think this provides a bit more detail and information in the actual analysis process. Yeah, and the iteration, as Adele was saying, is key. Being informed on the group response without, being biased. Both, I saw the question on confirmation bias, but also other type of biases is a key item. And of course, we're still talking about a mixed method research, right? So yeah, I will stop there for now. But yeah.
Thank you both. So the other question and theme that's coming through is panel size and sort of the scales to be used. So there's questions on, could we use more binary scales, use a 7 rather than 5-point Likert, and also the main one is, what size of panel should we aim for?
Well, shall I start, or please, Emanuele, go ahead.
No, go. It's fine, no problem.
No, I mean the size. It is a very recurrent question. So, what's the optimal size? Again, it goes back to the research topic. So, if it's a very narrow technical consents that we're looking at, normally smaller samples are fine. Smaller sample of specialized experts, and we're talking about maybe 10, 20 experts, then normally are enough. If the topic that we're looking at it's broader, it's, for instance, we're looking at broader policy alignment, then larger samples are needed. Obviously, the more stakeholders we are engaging, the bigger the panel has to be, because the something that's very important is definitely the balance of stakeholder presence within a panel, so that each stakeholder groups carries the same weight within the generation of the results. And this was about the panel size. I don't know, Emanuele, if you had anything you wanted to add on this.
No, that indeed, I mean, what we have at the moment that you mentioned are the reporting guidelines. We don't have methodological guidelines that are fully, endorsed. The reporting guidelines explain, as you're saying, a clear reasoning behind the number of panelists. So why are you covering? So first of all, which type of profile you want to cover? You need to consider geographic scope, baseline characteristics of the profiles you want to cover, and how these items, drive your number. This is the reason. This is what the reporting guidelines tell us. It's not how do you calculate, because if you want to get consensus, of course, on every heart disease patient in Europe, you can go for a super high number because it's a super generic profile. But if you want, as we were, people that could represent the entire community, then you go for a smaller number because that's something very specific you're looking for, right? It might also be seen as an excuse to reduce the number, but the management of the Delphi group is an essential item, especially with qualitative inputs and one-on-one interviews. Having super large group doesn't bring you anywhere but a statistical analysis, which is just a bit more than a survey, of course, also with controlled rounds. Therefore, the balance between these two items is key. The important thing that the reporting guidelines tell us is to explain the reasoning. And I've seen some publication being listed on the calculation. There are recent scoping reviews as well as narrative review that go and look at what was done so far in terms of consensus. You will see that alone lands something between 8 and 20 for many of the disease areas, many of the groups, and then you will see also larger sample sizes. Different rounds. Again, we don't have a methodological guideline. Maybe that's needed, something endorsed, but as long as universities or authorities don't bring that level required, we will not get there. I think we're getting there with the methodological, with the reporting guidelines, but that's just on the reasoning and explaining why. A lot of the papers don't even explain why, and that's a big mistake, I think.
Just because we're getting at time, I'll answer one question myself because it'll be a quick answer of, is IRB review required? Maybe. Please do check. IRBs will happily tell you if it's not required. There can be guidelines on their website, but do always check. It is not always required, but you need to confirm that one. On that, thank you very much, everyone, for attending. I believe when you registered, if you selected that, you'd be happy for those to opt into communications. We'll receive the slides and questions as well. There's so many questions. Thank you for submitting them all. I know we've not been able to answer them all. We will answer them where we can when we sort of get in contact with you, and feel free to contact us as well. Have a fantastic rest of the day and week.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for your time and
Thank you.
attention today, and thank you to our panelists for their time and expertise as well. As mentioned in the beginning of this webinar, it was recorded and will be sent via email to all registered attendees in approximately 2 business days, as well as posted on the ISPOR Webinar Series webpage. Additionally, there will be an email provided for any unanswered questions that you might have. Thank you, and have a great rest of your day.